before know how really good he is, and we're kind of excited about this. I'm Sherry Levy, co-chairman with Dr. Ovid Vitas. Now I'm going to give you my bi-monthly talk. Reach into your pockets, reach into your pocketbooks, turn them off. There ain't nothing important for the next hour except us and Joel. Let's please thank our most gracious and generous food fairy, Elizabeth Conklin, for her kindness in providing us with a most delicious snack this morning. Thank you, Elizabeth. Always, she's here. Also to remind you that Manuel, how much we appreciate his efforts to keep our show on the road with as few sound and technical glitches as possible. And if any of you have done the lecture circuit in this community, you know how very blessed we are to not only have a good sound system, but someone to keep it going. So a special thanks to him this morning. Now, our next meeting for the history group will be Monday, June the 3rd, 10 o'clock in this ballroom. Our wonderful speaker will be Lynn Shift-Horus. She'll take us back to the era of World War II and some years after that mega horror. She will slip into the secret world of Pope John the 23rd. Lynn can mesmerize you as she takes history and makes it alive and real. So put the date on your schedule and meet me here the first Monday in June. Today, Monday, May 20th in history. In 1861, the capital of the Confederacy moved from Montgomery to Richmond, two places for you to visit. In 1861, North Carolina voted to secede from the Union. In 1932, Amelia Earhart took off from Newfoundland for Ireland to become the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. And Dan, wherever you are, in 1939, regular transatlantic air service began as Pan American Airways plane took off from Fort Washington, New York, bound for Europe. And today's share of Sonny and Cher is 69. Time flies. In the world our speaker is going to talk about, 1600s and 1700s, the floor of the cottages was dirt. Only the wealthy had something other than dirt. Hence the saying, dirt poor. The wealthy had slate floors that could get slippery in the winter. So they spread straw on the floor to keep their footing. As winter wore on, they added more until when you opened the door, it would start slipping outside. You know what's coming, don't you? A piece of wood was put across the door. Hence, we now step over the threshold. And now it's my pleasure. I promised you, Joel, I wouldn't talk a lot this morning. And now it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to my talented and supportive co-chairman, Dr. Ovid Vitas, who will introduce today's speaker. Please give Ovid a big hand.
Thank you, Sherry. Well, we had a great pleasure to have Joel Rubin again, our club member. Joe began the study of Russian history in the mid-1950s. Then, with the launching of the Sputnik in 1957, all these books and articles began to appear about the history of Russia since the revolution, but very little material on the Russian history before the Communist Revolution. During his graduate work at New York University. He was working there for one of his master's degrees. He studied the Rurik dynasty, which began around the year 1900. He also studied Polish language and literature. He was motivated to study the Romanov dynasty with the help of Russian emigres, the Russian Orthodox priest, and was all enhanced by Joel's insatiable curiosity in Russian history. He was a teacher for more than 30 years. Joel holds a master's degrees and a PhD in American literature and a master's degrees in Russian literature. Today, Joel will tell us the story of Peter the Great, this giant of a man who ruled the Tsardom of Russia and later the Russian Empire until his death. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Joel Rubin to you.
Well, good morning. Thank you for coming. And Elizabeth, I thank you as well for the delicious cake and refreshments. I'm happy to introduce the ruler of Russia, to whom the appellation great truly applies, because he was the one who brought Russia from its primitive darkness into the light of the Western world. His legacy upon Russia exists even today, and that legacy may even have helped bring down the communist regime. In 2005, President Putin indicated that he wanted a new teacher's manual written for the history of Russia. And the teacher's manual was A Modern History of Russia, 1945 to 2006, a manual for history teachers. You'll notice that it doesn't go beyond 1945. And he indicated to a group of history teachers when he presented the manual that Russia did best only when it was ruled by a very strong government. And he bemoaned the failure of communism and the fall of communism. And he indicated to the teachers the following: we are talking about the failure of a course started by Peter the Great and pathetically continued by pro-Western Democrats after 1988, referring primarily to Gorbachev. I just want to make one note as we speak about Peter. Keep in mind that he was not that great to the poor people. None of them were. They were part of the land, as we'll see in a moment. 65% of his budget went for military purposes, building ships, and eventually building St. Petersburg. He wanted his way. He was an autocrat. He was going to get his way. And he could be brutal as well as generous. But as an autocrat, he knew that he could do whatever he wanted. Peter and all the Romanovs were related to the first wife of Ivan IV, Ivan the Dread. You know him as the Terrible. Peter's grandfather was the first Romanov. And if you take a look at this chart, you'll see that Michael was the great-great-great grandnephew of Anastasia, who was the first wife of Ivan, a woman he loved very much. She died rather tragically. But her father was, her father's first name was Roman. And it is from that that the Romanov dynasty takes its name. There were three rulers who changed the face of Russia. Keep in mind that Peter just didn't wake up one morning and say, I'm going to do wonderful things, but rather he built upon his predecessors. And Ivan instituted many changes to the powers and authority of the Tsar. He took all control under his reign. That was very important because you still had principalities and everything else. And he also began to take control of the church, a process that was not completed until Peter's father, Alexei. At the time he came in, Peter gradually had to come to power, as we'll see, even though at the age of 10 he was the Tsar. And the last and perhaps greatest ruler of Russia would be Catherine. There would be 6 rulers after Catherine's reign, only 2 of whom were really noteworthy for being rulers. The others were too consumed with their power to do anything to develop Russia into a nation in which the people could have developed developed Russia into a great nation. But the greatness of Russia begins with her reign. And when you read the great Russian books, you'll see that many are speaking French and everything. Well, she started that. Very remarkable woman. But she was the recipient of the legacy left by those 2. And by the way, she probably was the most intelligent ruler that Russia ever had. This is a detail from a famous statue of Peter the Great. It shows Galatea and Pygmalion, and here you have Peter remaking Russia into something new. I always thought, here's Peter, but that he somehow Rastrelli put Peter in that also, so maybe making it into his own image. The first ruler of the Romanov dynasty was Peter's grandfather, Michael, and he became Tsar at the age of 16. After a great many internal disorders and foreign invasions, and a rapid succession of pretenders to the throne and people who usurped the throne, whose reigns lasted sometimes a matter of days, sometimes months. It was a very bloody time in Russia, known as the Time of Troubles. He was considered the best choice for Tsar, possibly because of his relation to the Rurik dynasty through his great aunt. But what was important about his reign, there was a peasant class in Russia, and they were poor, but they were able to own land, farmland, and gather some meager income. He reduced them to serfs, And the difference between a serf and a slave is that the serf becomes part of the land. In other words, if a landowner was selling 40 acres and that on those acres lived 12 or so serfs, they went with the land. And the reason Michael did that was to increase tax revenue. If you ever want to read a rather enjoyable book, it's Nikolai Gogol's Dead Souls. It's a classic. The hero of the book goes around Russia buying up the souls of serfs who have died, for a particular reason. Also, Michael made peace with both Sweden and Poland long before Russia's enemies. And under his reign, there was an increase in the diplomatic and commercial and cultural contact with Western Europe. However, that contact was really started by Ivan IV, Ivan the Dread. The other, 2 weeks ago, Professor Schiffhorst gave a talk here about the Great Awakening. And he spoke about 12th century and 13th century Europe and the areas leading up to the Enlightenment. In Russia, the Enlightenment didn't come until many years later, probably with Catherine the Great. The dichotomy of the two social classes, the serfs and other poor, and then those who had the money, was so different socially and spiritually that in the 18th century, they even spoke different languages. By the time Catherine passed away, leading up all the way through the reign of the last Tsar, Nicholas II, the language at court was French. And there were many who spoke French far better than they spoke Russian. And the government essentially was interested in territorial expansion. They were not interested in developing social institutions, educational institutions. Rather, they were interested in gathering land. Even though the intellectual power that they did produce was very, very great. But there was still this dichotomy between them. Peter's father was a very remarkable man. Like his father, he too became Tsar at 16, and he was known as the quiet Tsar. He lived more of a monastic life. He was interested in making the court a place that was free of tension. There was no animosity in him. He wanted to develop Russia into a great power, but because his father pretty much maintained the same policies as those who ruled before him, it was very, very difficult for him. He became very interested in an area outside of Moscow called the German Quarter. And this will play a big part in Peter's life as well. And it was largely composed of Germans, Dutch, English, Scottish merchants, and mercenary officers. And he was very strongly influenced by Western elements, by his association with that German quarter. By the way, the word for German in Russian is Niemets. Niemoy is mute. It's a person who is mute, cannot make sounds. because when the Russians heard the Germans speaking German, they thought that they were mute and they were trying to say something. So that pretty much stuck. His first wife died after giving birth to her 13th child. And he was very fond of her. She left, well, I mean, yes, of course. I guess that's where we get the idea of killing one with kindness. She was the mother of 3 children, all of whom would become rulers before Peter. But in the German quarter, he visited a family who was heavily influenced by the West. Was one of his ministers. He was married to a Scottish woman, Mary Hamilton. And Mary Hamilton had a ward, so she was the guardian of a young girl, and that girl was brought up in Western ways. Alexei fell in love with her, and he married her. And just one other thing, because this is also one of the key things of Alexei's reign was his conflict with this man, Patriarch Nikon. Not the camera, Nikon, but there was a schism in the Russian Orthodox Church. They seemed always to be fighting about something. It was an issue of whether you cross yourself with 2 fingers or 3 fingers, or how the word Jesus should be spelled in Church Slavonic. And these brought the great schemes in the church. He had enough of it. And he ordered Nikon, who was the patriarch was like the Pope, to put an end to it. And Nikon refused. So he overthrew Nikon, and he took over the church, and he opened the way for Peter, and then Catherine the Great, who fought the domination of the church, which was something that had brought great financial problems to the rulers of Russia. This was his second wife, Natalia Narishkina. And there's something rather strange about the name Mary Hamilton. Before he died, Ivan IV convinced Queen Elizabeth, with whom he had a 15-year correspondence, not always on the best of terms, to send him one of her ladies in waiting. He wanted to marry her, and her name was Mary Hamilton. And fortunately for Mary, Ivan died before she got on the ship. When Alexei died, his oldest son became Tsar. And this was the half-brother of Peter. And he was a very interesting individual. He was heavily crippled. But even though he was crippled, he wasn't crushed by these terrible disabilities, and he showed that he was he wanted to be a reformer. And even though he could not lead his armies, he was often taken to battles on a litter. And the atmosphere at the court ceased to be oppressive, something he gained from his father, a certain calmness. He was an intelligent man, Alexei made sure that all of his children were educated, and he knew Latin, he spoke fluent Polish, composed poetry, and he did not have any children. And when he died, he did not name a successor. This was very important in the monarchy at the time. If the ruler did not name a successor, there was often a great conflict, usually between the families of the dead Tsar's wives. They all wanted power. They would fight with each other, and that's what happened here. When Fyodor died, he was about 22 or so, there was a problem because there were two possible claimants to the throne. One was Ivan the Fifth, sorry, who was Peter's half-brother. He was the son of Alexei's first wife. The problem was that he, mentally, there was something wrong with him. He was unable to rule. He was a sickly child and mentally and physically handicapped. And he was still only 3 years old when his mother died. And then developed a battle for succession that would leave a very strong impact on Peter for the rest of his life. By the way, Ivan did marry, and one of his daughters became Empress Anna. She was the second empress of Russia. But there was a group that wanted a say in the succession. This was a violent group initially established by Ivan IV as a palace guard. As time went on, Ivan himself and even those during the time of troubles, including Michael and Alexei, could not necessarily pay them with money, so they gave them land, and they became rather powerful as a result. The two families of Alexei's wife each claimed sovereignty over the throne. But it was clear that Ivan could not become Tsar. So a deal was struck in which Peter would become Tsar. He was 10 years old at the time. And the Streltsy had heard a rumor that Ivan had been poisoned, because the Streltsy were in favor of putting Ivan on the throne. So they stormed the Kremlin, and Peter's mother tried to protect the boy. The Streltsy came in, and they slaughtered as many people as they could catch. They were a rather violent breed, and in keeping with Russian mentality, they evidently celebrate them even to this day. Ivan saw his uncle slaughtered, he saw other people, and out of this chaos came the oldest surviving child of Alexei, the oldest sister of Fyodor and Ivan, Sophia. Sophia was 25 years old at the time, and she spoke to the Streltsy and came up with an agreement that the two boys would rule jointly as co-Tsars, and that she would be the regent. And they agreed to that, and she had built for the boys double thrones. And the throne had like a plywood wall in the back, and she would, there was a hole in the back, and whenever they were speaking with anybody as their diplomats or whatever, she would listen in and tell them what to say. It's very interesting that I could only find one book ever written about her. She was demonized by historians because as a woman, she felt at that time that she could rule Russia. She was a very educated woman, and in fact, she asked her father, Alexei, for permission to sit in on his councils, you know, with his nobles. And she was an advisor to her father, and during the reign of Fyodor, she was a very important advisor to him as well. But rather than being a temporary regent, at some particular point she surrounded herself with people who felt, well, get rid of the kids and you could become, you know, Tsarina. And she had a portrait painted of herself, and if you look very carefully, she has the royal regalia. So Peter at this time was growing up. He was 10 years old when he, you know, his father died, and he also was living near the German quarter. He spent a great deal of time there, but he also spent a great deal of time playing soldier. And he would bring the boys of his town and neighboring towns, this is at 10 or 11 years old, and he would train them and they had artillery. And Sophia let him do this because she knew he was a very intelligent fellow, and she didn't want him around. So she said to him, well, go and play soldier. Well, unfortunately, the soldiers he developed, unfortunately for Sophia, would eventually turn into the Imperial Guards. And when the Streltsy came back and said, you know, we'd like to make Sophia Tsarina, there was no support. She was left alone, hanging. And Peter, with this toy army, as it was referred to, was able to wrest control from Sophia and took complete power of her. She was sent to a convent, which was a very common thing for Tsars to do to get rid of their wives. You know, the ladies of the court lived in an area called the Terem. Sounds like harem, but it's sort of a quasi-harem. That's where they were relegated to. They lived like chattel at the whims of their husband, and if they displeased the husbands, they were sent to convents or killed or conveniently disappeared. We don't even know the names of many of these women. Ivan IV had 7 wives. We only know the names of a couple. and God knows what happened to them. But as a young boy of 10, he played soldier, and he had a magnificent toy soldier set. But, as I said, he actually animated those soldiers with all these boys who, at the time he started, were 10 years old. Now they're 16, 17 years old, and they've surrounded him and protected him. The German quarter was a rather interesting place. And I'm sorry if the fidelity of this picture isn't very good. This was a house of a family, the Mons family, M-O-N-S. We'll meet them in a minute. And if you take a look, there's a church, windmill, other things. The Russians, especially the church, did not care for that was there at all. They felt that bringing these Western values to Russia was something that was going to destroy Russia. And they didn't even approve of Alexei's second wife because of her Western influence. But in this German quarter, in which the young Peter and teenage Peter, and even when he was Tsar, spent a great deal of time, had some people who would influence him. One was a man named Timmerman. He was a Dutchman, and he felt Peter should know things about being a ruler. And he began to prepare him for being a ruler. And he indicated to Peter that in order to be a good ruler, you have to be educated. And it was Timmerman who developed in Peter the idea that there's a world outside of Russia that could benefit Russia. And I don't have a picture of Timmerman, but I do have a picture of some other individuals. Patrick Gordon was a Scotsman, Catholic, who fought on the royalist side, in the losing side, English Civil War. He came to Russia, and he became a general. And it was Gordon, as general, who was a friend of Peter, and also was instrumental in saving Peter on various occasions when there were uprisings, one of which we will discuss in a moment. Another man was Franz Lefort, who was from Switzerland, and he taught Peter some elements of diplomacy. He also taught him about alcoholism and women. And Peter had a problem because he was becoming too much like Lefort rather than Gordon. And then in the German quarter, Peter met a woman introduced by Lefort, and this was her family's house, and he had a 12-year affair with her. And in some of those years he was married. But he tried to divorce his wife. She wouldn't let him do that. It was a big problem with the church at that point. And the affair ended when Peter discovered that she was having an affair with two other people. It's a pretty big house, so I guess you could get lost from one to another. There's also one other thing. A lot of these pictures I've taken from Russian sites. And this particular picture, I never really felt it was her until I read in a history book by a Russian author just recently that no pictures survive of her. So maybe that isn't it. Dos Vidania, as we say. Peter's mother was getting very concerned about his drinking and everything else, and she insisted that he get married. And he married this woman, Yevdokia. And you know, for a man of action, Yevdokia wasn't the woman to whom he should be wed, because he was 17. She was a very pious woman. I'm sure she must have been more beautiful than that when he married her, but she lived pretty much the life of a nun. She did bear a child to Peter, Alexei, we'll meet, and they were married in 1689, and finally in 1698 she was unceremoniously removed to a distant convent away from Moscow. I told you because she wouldn't agree to a divorce, so he wanted to get rid of her in another way. I told you that he could be very cruel, and he was very cruel to her. She did not bother him. She was very happy to let him live his life as he wanted. She didn't want any part of what he was doing. He finally divorced her, and while she was at this distant monastery, he came up with the idea that she was an adulteress, and he put her on trial, and nothing came of it, but she remained there till in the convent till the accession to the throne of her grandson Peter II. Then Peter had himself crowned, and there are very interesting diamonds, all these minerals and gems and furs. Of course, you wonder where they get the money for all this. Well, they were selling it to all of Europe, especially the furs. And there are so many diamond mines in Russia that if Russia were to release them, the price of diamonds would drop precipitously. And De Beers made a deal with the communists not to do that. So, but that's an amazing. You could see that in the armory if you visit Moscow. Most amazing thing of his reign was called the Great Embassy, and he was the first Tsar to travel outside the borders of Russia. He was very interested in shipbuilding, and he wanted to learn more about shipbuilding, but the main purpose of his mission was to gain support against the Ottoman Empire. 250 people were on the embassy. Peter traveled incognito as Pyotr Mikhailov for his grandfather, Michael. He traveled incognito. He was 6'7" or 8", and he had a regal demeanor. So, you know, there were people wherever the embassy traveled, they would run to see him. The first place he stopped was in Riga, Latvia, then under the control of Sweden, and he was refused access to see the fortifications of Riga. Sweden wasn't going to let him see it. I mean, he was an enemy of Sweden, and he took it as an affront that he would never forget, and that would come back to haunt Sweden at a later time. He refused to go to France. people he had sent to France were abused by the king and his court, and he thought that their behavior was aloof and abusive. And for my visit to France some years ago, I could add a few adjectives, but and it's rather strange because since the reign of Catherine II, the Russian court was French. Everything was French. They spoke French and everything else. In Holland and in England, he was treated very well. William III was not a member of the English royal family. He was married to Mary, whose father, James, had to leave the throne in the Glorious Revolution. And William gave him everything he needed to build a navy, but he would not give him any support in fighting the Turks. Another interesting thing is I told you Peter was about 6'7". William is 5 foot, so they must have made an interesting couple. And you know, like Catherine, he probably was one of the most intelligent monarchs in England. He was well received wherever he went, and he wanted to learn. He learned clockmaking and as well as shipbuilding. This is a plaque that's in Portsmouth, England, that commemorates his visit. You see him with a ship. But there was another problem. He also went to anatomy lessons in Holland, and he learned to do minor surgery and dentistry. And all this caused some terror among his servants and those close to him, because he was practicing on pulling teeth, and then if someone should say, well, you know, I got a little pain here, he maybe run out with a scalpel. But he stayed for 4 months in Holland, and in England he went to visit various shipbuilding areas and the mint and everything else. And he also visited King Frederick Wilhelm I of Prussia and met the Crown Prince, who would later become Frederick the Great, another man of great note. While he was about to leave for Venice, he got word that the Streltsy were rebelling. He had worked very hard to weaken them, and in weakening them, he tried to send them to different places, but now they were ready to overthrow him. And it was General Gordon, whom he met in the German quarter, who put down the rebellion. He felt that his sister Sophia was behind the revolt. And this is a remarkable picture, but it's not accurate because here's Red Square, and the executions didn't take place in Red Square. Here you could see some scaffolds. It was outside of Moscow, and about 2,400 people were executed. Some say that Peter and his friends took part in the executions, the beheadings, but it doesn't sound right, for what he did. But he thought his sister was behind it. She wasn't. She pretty much kept to herself. And if you take a look, you could see that there's somebody hanging there. And what he did is he executed some of these people right in front of her window and hung them from the window. As well, I told you he could be cruel. He changed the dress of Russia from the old boyars with long sleeves and everything else, and tried to modernize it. shorter sleeves, and he would go around and cut sleeves off. He had a complete catalog of clothes that people should wear, and he also didn't like beards. And he himself went around shaving people and without, soap or anything. And up here in Old Russian, you've read Crime and Punishment, and you remember the character Raskolnikov. And Raskol is an individual who's a dissenter, doesn't follow the law. And up here is saying the criminal says, listen, I do not want you to cut my beard. I will pay you the money, not to cut it. And Peter said, well, you want to wear a beard, you have to pay a tax. And if you paid a tax, you were given this badge to wear. And it actually says money taken, not money paid, but money taken because of that. He was given as a young boy, a slave. Was not unusual for monarchs after him, even into the reign of Nicholas II, to have black servants and black page boys. It looks like a cruel ornament. But Hannibal, Gannibal in Russian, became Peter's godson, and he adopted as a patronymic Petrovich after Peter. And he became a great general. He traveled with Peter when he went into battle, and then 2 years after Louis XIV died, Peter did visit France. He left Hannibal there to become trained as an engineer. He came back to Russia as a rather learned individual, and he was a great general. One of his sons was the grandfather of Alexander Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet. Problem is, when you have too much power, you may tend to misuse it if it's there, to be abused. Peter needed an outlet to the sea. He was building his navy, and he was also building his city, St. Petersburg. And Sweden wouldn't let them have that access. Sweden occupied this area. This is a later map. Thus began what was called the Great Northern War. This is the city of Narva. And a battle was fought there with the King of Sweden, Charles II. He was 10 years younger than Peter. A very remarkable man, very much like Peter, except for this. Peter started wars. He never did. He only fought against those who started wars with him. And he was a very amazing tactician and everything else, a very learned man. And he defeated Peter at Narva. In fact, the defeat was so strong that Peter almost lost Moscow. But then Charles fell to something else that Napoleon and Hitler fell to. You don't go too deeply into Russia if you can't get out. And there was an area called Poltava. And Charles felt that he could somehow make headway into Poltava. Unfortunately, the Battle of Poltava went against him. Charles was injured in the battle and had to be taken away to Turkey, where he sought refuge in a litter. And eventually, Sweden and those who fought for Sweden were a bit tired of fighting. And in one of the later battles, when he wanted to regain power and everything else, he was engaged in another battle. His soldiers were not very pleased with fighting battles for him anymore, and one of them shot him. And Voltaire, a great friend of Catherine the Great, would note that the lesson of a king is that he should learn to make peace and live in peace, and that such a government was preferable to anything else. This, by the way, is an exit wound. For some reason, it's very unusual, the government of Sweden in 1910 took out the body, and historians and others wanted to determine if he really was shot. And I guess he really was. So, this was the heir to the throne, Peter's heir. He detested his father. He wasn't anything like his father. He was a very educated young man, but this was the son of Peter's first wife, who was put into a monastery, a convent, even during his lifetime. And he wouldn't do anything that an heir to the throne should do. He lacked energy, and he lacked devotion not only to Peter, but to Russia also. And Peter did not want to have anyone following him if he was unworthy of his rule, unworthy to rule. And he was married, and he did have a son who became Peter II. But his father gave him an ultimatum. You either change your ways or you give up your right to the throne. So in 1716, he fled to Austria, and he took with him a chambermaid who became his mistress. And after the Battle of Poltava, Russia became a very powerful country. And a message was received by the Austrian king: we want him back. And Austria wasn't going to get into a war with Peter. And Peter and Alexei met, and it became clear in that meeting that perhaps there was a plot to unseat Peter, and Alexei may not have been the motivating force of that plot, but he certainly may have been an instrument of it. And Alexei would not divulge the names of those who helped him run to Austria. So Peter made him renounce his right to the throne and threw him into a dungeon of some sort and had him tortured. And under torture, it became clear that indeed there was a plot to get rid of Peter. There was a council Peter set up to determine what should happen to Alexei. And the council determined that he had to be executed. So Peter got together with members of the church leadership, and he wanted them to give him a reason to agree to the execution. And they went back and deliberated, and they came back and they used as an example King David's relationship with his son Absalom. And they said that that was the only reason you would have, to execute your son. The son asked Peter to visit him in jail, which he did, and he was in very frail health. Peter agreed to a second meeting, and before he was to leave for that meeting, he received word that his son had died. But to this day, nobody knows how he died. So, Peter's navy was in full force. Here are sailing orders from 1719, signed by Peter. Russia was now a powerful military force. I'm almost finished. Just give me a few more moments. It was always the custom of Tsars to give away great tracts of land to people who had served them well. Now, Peter learned when his travels in Europe that instead of giving land, give medals. It was a new idea. And because he thought giving of land was very wasteful. And if you take a look at our own great military leaders, you'll notice they're not wearing anything. I mean, I guess the 5 stars he's wearing is good enough. But then, as we get into more modern times, and certainly here is a Russian general. However, these fellas all pale by what North Korea does. And none of them behind them have medals because they're wearing them. And I was wondering whether they're also wearing it on the back as well as the front. Catherine the First was the second wife of Peter. She was very devoted to him. During their marriage, Peter did have affairs. He had something like 11 children by different women. But she was a peasant woman, German, and she was very devoted to him. She went with him on military expeditions, and almost nothing is known about her. She is the first ruler of Russia. While Sophia was the first ruler, she was the first one to be, empress. She ruled for 2 years, but she was smart enough to know that she did not have, the intelligence to rule. So she put together committees of Peter's advisors, and they helped her rule. And by the way, Peter named her as empress while he was still alive. Coleridge had a dream about a beautiful city after he had taken opium. He had terrible arthritis, and opium was not, was a medication freely given for that. He had a dream, and he dreamt about the Xanadu, and then when he woke up, he wanted to write it down, but he could only remember part of it. I mean, maybe about a page and a half he was able to write. But a beautiful poem in Xanadu, Kubla Khan, a stately pleasure-dome decree, where Ralph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. And here comes Peter, who decides, well, this area of land is where he wants to build his window on the west, his access for his ships and everything else. Place was muddy. There was nothing there. It was infested the water was infested with bacteria, all sorts of insects. And he ordered his court to move there, whether they liked it or not. They built houses and everything else. Of course, the people who built these houses were like those who built the Great Wall of China, the Bloody Wall. Many died and completely forgotten. I mean, people live in glory there, but it took blood to build it. He died of a urinary tract infection, they think. And his wife, Catherine, was with him all the time he was dying. He received the last rites of the church, and his last words, as someone wrote down, so he was speaking to himself, "I hope God will forgive my many sins because of the good I tried to do for my people." He reigned for 43 years. One of their greatest leaders. And he's buried Peter and Paul Fortress. He died in 1725. This cartoon came out. You see that? It's called The Cat, The Mice Burying the Cat. They had these pamphlets, you know, they were cartoons. They were very popular at the time. And the inference is, well, now that the cat is gone, what are the mice going to do? In other words, after Peter, what? It's a very famous statue in St. Petersburg. It was erected by Catherine to Peter I. In Latin it says here, from Catherine II. And on the other side, it's the same thing in Russia. Notice Peter's hand pointing. It's pointing to the west. This is a stylistic wave, you know. And Pushkin wrote a poem called The Bronze Horseman. It's a very good translation from the Russian. And thus he mused, Peter, "From here indeed shall we strike terror in the Swede, and here a city by our labor founded shall gall our haughty neighbor. Here cut, so nature gives command, your window through on Europe. Stand firm-footed by the sea, unchanging. Aye, ships of every flag shall come, by waters they have never swum, and we shall revel freely ranging." So from greatness, we come to this. Brezhnev tried to go back after overthrowing Khrushchev, go back to the way things were with Stalin. Same idea he has. Gorbachev is greatly reviled in Russia. He's a great hero to the West, but not in Russia. And the reason is that he gave away all those countries like Latvia, Estonia, and everything else, which had large Russian populations and just floundered there. And it's not going to go any better than this. Alcoholic, first president of a free Russia, drunk all the time. Great, Clinton was a great fan of his because he made him laugh. But if you were in Russia, you weren't laughing as he did his buffoonery. Just like the Tsars, before he left the presidency, he said, "You vote for him." And his philosophy is called sovereign democracy, which means you hold elections because people want to do that, they want to vote, but you strip them of any meaning just to maintain a strong central government. certainly no Peter the Great. Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't say that.
Thank you, Joel. What a wonderful glimpse into a world we really don't know anything about. Are there any questions?
I just wondered if you're familiar with the Robert Massey books on great.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know.
I was wondering if you're familiar with the Robert Massey books on Peter the Great
Yes.
and Catherine the Great, and do you feel that they're accurate? And
Yes, they are. And unfortunately, I never could understand why the Peter the Great book was not as popular as the Catherine the Great book. But they were accurate.
I saw another question over here.
Who was it, and at what time was he designated the Great?
He was designated in his own lifetime by, I don't want to call it a parliament, but it was a group of advisors who asked him if he would object if they gave him that title. And who doesn't want to be called great? But in the Romanov dynasties, there were only two rulers called great. One was Catherine, and one was Peter. And none of them were great. There were two. There was one person, I just tell you very quickly, Alexander II was a contemporary of Lincoln, and he supported the federal government